Today, we're going on a journey into a spiritual tradition that started more than 2,500 years ago. But this isn't just about ancient history. We're looking at it as a quest to solve one of the most fundamental human problems there is, the problem of suffering. So let's just start with a question that pretty much flips everything we think we know on its head. What if the secret to being happy wasn't about getting more stuff, more success, more anything? What if it was actually about letting it all go? This very question, believe it or not, is right at the heart of our story, which starts with a man who literally had everything you could imagine. Our journey begins with a man named Siddhartha Gautama. Born way back around 563 BCE, he wasn't some wise old sage or a monk. Nope, he was a prince, born into a life of incredible luxury. But here's the thing. Even living in a perfect palace, totally shielded from the harsh realities of the world, couldn't stop the big questions that were starting to bubble up in his mind. So how in the world does a prince living in a bubble become one of the most influential spiritual leaders in history? Well, it all happens in four key moments. He starts out in total comfort, right? But curiosity, it gets the best of him, and he decides to venture outside the palace walls. And what he sees out there doesn't just surprise him, it absolutely shatters his entire worldview and sends him down a completely radical new path. The first thing he sees, for the very first time in his life, is an old man. Now, for someone who had only ever seen youth and strength, this was a massive shock. It was this sudden, jarring realization that everyone, including him, would one day get old and frail. And then he saw a sick man. This was the second gut punch. The idea that the body is so vulnerable, that good health isn't a guarantee, and that serious pain can hit anyone at any time. The perfect world he thought he lived in was just crumbling before his eyes. The third sight was the most final, the most absolute of all, a corpse being carried to cremation. This was it, the unavoidable, inescapable reality of death. He finally understood that life is temporary and that everything and everyone he loved would eventually be gone. So after these three just devastating sights, he saw a fourth. And this one was different. It was a wandering holy man, an ascetic, who had given up all his worldly possessions. But here's the crucial part. Even though this man had nothing, he looked calm, he looked peaceful. And that's when it clicked for Siddhartha. There was another way. Not a path to avoid suffering, because he'd just seen that was impossible, but a path to transcend it. That was it. Inspired by that sight, Siddhartha walked away from his palace, his family, his title, everything. For 6 long years, he threw himself into a grueling spiritual search. And finally, while meditating under a Bodhi tree, he had his breakthrough. He achieved enlightenment. He became the Buddha, which, simply means the awakened one. So what did he find? What was this big answer he spent 6 years looking for? Well, it wasn't some kind of mystical secret whispered by the universe. It was actually a really clear, profound diagnosis of the human condition. He called it the 4 Great Truths. Now, what's so amazing about this is just how logical it is. Seriously, think about it like a visit to the doctor. First, the doctor gives you the diagnosis. Okay, life involves suffering, or, a constant sense of dissatisfaction. Second, the cause. Your suffering comes from craving and attachment. Think about that endless desire for the next new thing, or the anxiety you feel refreshing your social media feed. Third, the prognosis. Hey, there's good news. There's a cure. This suffering can end. And finally, the prescription. Here's the specific path you need to follow to make that happen. And that brings us to the prescription itself. So if the 4 noble truths are the what the problem is, then the eightfold path is the how. It's the practical, step-by-step guide the Buddha laid out for anyone, anywhere, to end their own suffering. Let's take a look at what this path actually involves. The first thing to know is that this isn't some list of rigid do-or-die commandments. It's much more like a toolkit for living a more aware and intentional life. You can see the 8 parts here, and they all work together. They all support each other. You can basically group them into 3 main areas. Wisdom, like understanding things correctly. Ethical conduct, how you speak and act. And mental discipline, through things like mindfulness and concentration. It's a whole system for retraining our minds and our hearts. Right at the center of this path is the practice of mindfulness. And really, all that means is it's the skill of paying attention to what's happening right now, in this very moment, without judging it. By practicing this moment-by-moment awareness, we start to see our own thoughts and feelings more clearly, which is the absolute first step toward gaining some wisdom and freeing ourselves from our old knee-jerk reactions. Okay, so this whole eightfold path works within a certain view of how reality works. Two really foundational ideas here are karma and rebirth. Karma is basically the universal law of cause and effect, that our intentional actions, good or bad, have consequences down the line. And rebirth is this idea that our consciousness is like a continuous stream that carries on after death. Put them together and you get a framework where our actions in this life matter a lot. They shape not just our present, but our future too. Now, as these really profound ideas started to spread out from India across Asia and eventually all over the world, they didn't just stay the same. They weren't static. They adapted. They evolved. They blended with new cultures and gave rise to all these different schools of thought, but all of them tracing back to that one single source of enlightenment under a tree. You can see the three main branches that developed right here, and each one has its own distinct flavor. Theravada is the oldest school, and it's really focused on individual enlightenment through your own personal effort. Mahayana kind of expands that goal. The idea is to achieve enlightenment not just for yourself, but for the sake of all living beings, driven by this deep sense of compassion. And then there's Vajrayana, which uses techniques like rituals and visualizations to try and accelerate that path, often with the help of a spiritual guide. So how did these ideas actually survive for 2,500 years? It's pretty amazing, actually. For centuries, they were passed down purely through oral tradition, just from teacher to student, word for word. It was only much later that they were meticulously written down in scriptures, like the Pali Canon, which is what preserves the Buddha's earliest known teachings for us today. Okay, so this all might be sounding a bit ancient and, abstract, but these ideas are very much alive right now. So how do people actually take these teachings and integrate them into their modern, busy lives? Well, it usually comes down to a few core, really tangible practices. The central practice, the one at the very heart of it all, is meditation. That's the direct training of the mind. And that's often supported by physical practices like yoga, which helps to balance the body and mind, and by community rituals and ceremonies that help mark spiritual milestones and just reinforce the teachings. And that brings us right back to where we started. Siddhartha's entire life-changing quest was sparked not by some ancient book or divine vision from the heavens, but by simply really looking at the world around him and seeing the raw, unfiltered reality of life. So that brings the final question back to us, to you and me. When you take a moment to look closely at your own life and at the world around you, what truths do you see?